Hi again, my name is Dipal Parekh, and we're continuing our conversation with Dr. Paul Wagner on the topic of thinking about morality. This is the second part of the video. Please check out the first video that we had conversation with him earlier. Dr. Paul Wagner is a full-time professor of philosophy and logic with the College of Human Sciences and Humanities, and also he is the area coordinator for statistics, research, and educational psychology with the College of Education at the University of Houston Clear Lake. He has served as a vice president of Association of Philosophers in Education, former executive secretary of the Philosophy of Education Society. He has also served as the vice chair of the Human Rights Commission in the city of Columbia, Missouri, and he was on the board of directors of Leadership Houston, also on the board of directors for Houston Volunteer Center, and also on the board of directors for Houston Marathon. Dr. Wagner has also served as a consultant in strategic planning to numerous corporations, universities, and medical centers. He was a professor of management theory of the MBA program at the University of Houston, Victoria, where he also taught a course in organizational behavior. And of course, he taught ethics in many universities. So welcome again, Dr. Wagner.
Glad to be here, DePaul.
All right, thank you for continuing this conversation on the topic of thinking about morality. My first question for this topic session, sometimes the most unfair thing we can do is treat everyone equally. And you have mentioned this in your books. Explain why that is so, and can you define the word fair?
Fair is a matter of assigning to no one a disadvantage prior to the commencement of an activity. That's what fair means. Equal just means treating everybody the same. There was an episode actually in the Houston area, maybe 20 years ago. John Stossel talked about it. He and Barbara Walters talked about it on one of the evening news shows one time. And the story went like this. You had an Eagle Scout who was number 2 in his class. He showed up at school just a couple of days before the semester was over with. He was scheduled to be salutatorian of his high school. He had already gotten a congressional appointment to go to West Point. The night before he showed up on the last couple of days of school, he had an Eagle Scout meeting. And he woke up the next morning, he was a little running late, and he just threw on his Eagle Scout shirt and a pair of jeans that he wore the night before, and he went running off to school. A campus policeman saw a bulge in the young man's pocket and wanted him to open his pockets, and there was his Boy Scout knife. The Eagle Scout tried to explain, I just threw on my pants this morning. I was at an Eagle Scout meeting last night, and I had my knife with me then because we sometimes do little arts and crafts things at our meetings. And the campus policeman took him down to the principal, and before you know it, when the whole thing was over with, he had been expelled from school for 3 days. Now, one of the things that got John Stossel and Barbara Walters all upset was you, at that time at least, you could not go to one of the country's military academies if you had ever been expelled from school. Well, there he was, expelled from school just a couple of days before school was over with. Number 2 in his class. And it sounded very reasonable that it was a mistake, an oversight. John Stossel even interviewed the superintendent of schools from the district where his high school was. And the superintendent of schools just sat back in his big chair and said, told John Stossel, well, I don't make the policies. If you're unhappy with our policies, you're just going to have to talk to the board. Now, and then he went on to say, we have to expel them because that's what our policies are, and we have to treat everybody the same. Do you? In all of our courts of law, we recognize the concept of mitigating circumstances, where something that perhaps the law hadn't anticipated, once we became aware of it, should mitigate our judgment about the situation. But here was a school superintendent who didn't understand the complexity of a concept such as mitigating circumstances. So he wanted to treat the kid the same. And some other people, educators, commenting on it, saying, well, I mean, in his defense, I mean, you start making allowances for one kid and then you have to make them for everybody. Why would you have to make them for everybody? If there's a good reason for making an allowance for one, then unless there's a similar good reason for making an allowance for somebody else, I and most of the nation at the time had no idea why making an allowance for one means that you have to make allowances for everybody. In this case, the superintendent thought the same punishment was being given to this kid as might be given to a kid who was in a gang, who oftentimes is carrying a knife so he can get payment for drugs he sells from other students at school, and you got to keep your eye on this kid. Well, if you were to catch that kid 3 days before school's over with, you'd expel him for 3 days. Say, well, a knife in each kid's pocket, they each get expelled for 3 days. There you have it. It's fair. There's nothing fair about it. The kid who likes to sell drugs and he's carrying a knife to make sure he gets paid is involved in a very different sort of act than an Eagle Scout who overslept and happened to go rushing out to school with his Boy Scout knife still in there. Now, when you expel the drug salesman, he just has more time to sell more drugs, and he doesn't like to be in school anyhow, and he doesn't care that he's off for about 3 days. He's going to hang around the school just a block or two away and do what he normally does. But the Eagle Scout, he's losing at the time, it would have been over $250,000 scholarship. To go to a military academy like West Point, you're getting a first-rate engineering degree. You're also getting your clothes are all taken care of. Your room and board is taken care of. They're even going to give you money to come home several times throughout the year to visit family. And on 1 or 2 summers, I can't remember which, you will spend the summer going through the equivalent of basic training, and you will be paid for that. And at the end of it all, you get a job for 4 years. That's what you're taking away from the high school salutatorian. The two punishments are nowhere near the same. You'd have to be blind, closed-minded, almost mean to draw an analogy between the Eagle Scout and some other student who deliberately was carrying a knife to discipline some people that didn't pay him what they owed him for a drug sale or whatever. One of the most unfair things you can do is treat everybody equally, because the circumstances, when they're studied carefully, simply may not be equal. And with the concept of punishment, the concept of punishment is supposed to mean that you're inflicting deliberately some sort of injurious effect on someone for moral wrongdoing. There was no moral wrongdoing in the case of the Eagle Scout. There was a simple oversight.
That's a really, really good example, and it makes sense. It makes sense.
We can give you, let me give you 2 other quick examples along the same, because it's frightening when these things happen. There was a 5-year-old boy somewhere in Florida, and this is around a couple of years later than that. So we're talking about in the 90s sometime. Little boy got expelled from school for sexual harassment. Well, okay, that could seem reasonable. What was he doing? Well, he was running around kissing the girls, trying to kiss the girls. That sounds kind of, how old was this kid that's trying to run around kissing girls? Oh, he was 5. Wait a minute, he was how old? 5. What do you mean he was running around trying to kiss the girls? Well, out in the playground, he was trying to run up and kiss the girls, and they would go, oh, get away, and run away from him. And you expelled him for sexual harassment? He doesn't even know what sex is. He doesn't know what sexual harassment is. And probably the little girls don't know what it is. In fact, I think I've seen that same little boy get copied on half the playgrounds of our country. He's a little boy who wants attention, and he teases the little girls and they make him go away. But he got expelled for sexual harassment. When I first started telling you the story, you were probably thinking of some kind of high school boy who was doing deeds that were clearly black and white wrong in anybody's eyes. And yet that's not what happened at all. And yet the little boy got expelled. Here's another story. A teacher who had asthma had an asthma attack while teaching her class. She went to her purse to grab her, inhaler out. It was empty. And she's choking. A girl in her class, a high school girl, who also was asthmatic, runs up to the teacher with her breather apparatus and gives it to the teacher, which the teacher used, and it cleared up her lungs. She saw the little girl as a hero. The little girl, this was a high school girl. And so she freely told people about what this girl did to save her in the classroom. What was the end of the story? The school suspended the girl for 3 days. For what? Well, the school had zero tolerance policy. Had zero tolerance policy with regards to the exchange of drugs. And so
it's a pump.
And so in giving the teacher that pump with the chemical in it for clearing up the lungs, she was transporting drugs from one person to another. So she was suspended for 3 days. The school teacher was put on suspension for a week. Wow. There's a big difference between equal and fair. And everybody ought to be able to look at our schools and see, first and foremost, they're places where we find fairness in abundance. And equality is something that we direct attention to as appropriate. As Aristotle would say, you treat equals equally and you treat unequals unequally. So schools is a great example. In schools, you have kids who have learning compromising circumstances. And so we spend more in special education to accommodate those students than we do on the other students. And that seems to make perfectly good sense, doesn't it? So we're not treating everybody equally. And if we said if we were to insist that you must spend just the same dollar amount on special ed kids as you do on the other children, then what you would be doing would be horribly unfair. Now, how is it that you can understand that, but you can't understand the Eagle Scouts situation? You can't understand the high school girl who rescued her teacher with an inhaler for asthma. You can't understand the 5-year-old boy trying to get attention by running around on the playground kissing little girls.
Wow, that's intense. Is there a duty to refrain from harming others? Do you have a right not to be harmed by others? And then what is the relationship between duties and rights?
I think if we recall the last time that we met, talking about Bernard Gert saying that there's 11 moral rules that seem to cross all cultures and even historic borders. And one of those things would seem to be a freedom from malicious harm imposed by others. Freedom from malicious harm, and we talked about malicious, the type of intent that is. a freedom of malicious harm from others. Now, anytime a right has ever been created in anybody, simultaneously with the creation of any right is a duty. It makes no sense to say you created a right that didn't also involve a duty being imposed on self or someone else. And so, for example, if you have you're in a community and it's a democracy and you have a right to vote, that means that the other members of the community have a duty not to interfere with your exercise of that right. Similarly, as often assumed, not made as clear as perhaps it should, if you have a right to vote, then you have a duty to find out as much detail about the issues as you can before you walk in and cast a random vote, which essentially sabotages democracy. Democracy is built on the wisdom of the crowd, not on randomness. So, do people have a right to be free of harm by others? Yeah, and that means others have a duty not to harm people maliciously, not to inflict malicious harm on other people. Rights and duties are different things. Every right that is ever created has created a duty in somebody. Teachers are in a position to create all sorts of rights for individual students or the whole class. You know, teacher's law is the law of the land in that classroom day by day. And so the teacher to recognize the difference between simply being reckless with giving permissions and being Mr. or Miss Nice Guy, whatever it might be, has to also think to herself, what duties am I creating in myself or others? If I tell the children that you have to have this assignment in by Thursday, and if not, then you're going to have your final grade dropped by 1 point for every day you're late. And Susie comes up and she says, it's Wednesday the day before. She said, my dad died last night. I can't think about anything. I'm not going to get that assignment in. Well, the teacher might see that as a proper mitigating circumstance to allow that student to turn their paper in next week. And so the teacher, if they've decided that they should extend that right to this child who is laboring under this mitigating circumstance, saying no more than that, the teacher has now placed a burden, a duty upon herself, not to grade that student's essay when they turn it in with prejudice, meaning you don't reduce that paper a point for every day it was late because you created a right for the student to turn it in late. And in doing so, you created a duty on your part to grade the paper without prejudice.
Thank you for that. So to continue with the same topic context, do individuals have an obligation not to cause malicious harm to another person? Or do individuals have obligation to be charitable towards others? And
That's
what
a
does
good
the
question.
word, I'm sorry,
Okay, go ahead.
what does the word obligation really mean?
Well, the word obligation means that if you fail in your obligations, you're duty bound to live up to your obligations. If you fail in your obligations, then you are guilty of some misdoing, some mischief. And that can be minor, it can be severe. Now, the very idea of an animal, a herd animal that is instinctually inclined to be cooperative, and what we've talked about before with morality resting upon that instinct to cooperate in a richly textured language, allowing us to come up with rules of guidance. One of the things that is going to be unavoidable, and again would fit in with Bernard Gert's 11 rules, yeah, you don't maliciously harm other people. That seems to be pretty straightforward from what we have just said. Now, nowhere in Gert's 11 rules, and not to say he's the final say on anything, but nowhere in Gert's rules or anywhere else are you going to find an obligation to be charitable to others. To be charitable is to go above and beyond what you're obligated to do. A simple charitable act when you're going into a store might be to hold the door open for a mother carrying a child or for an older person who is approaching. You're not obligated to do that. If you do it, that's a nice thing to do, and you should be applauded for that. That's how you build virtue. But you're not obligated to do that. Nobody can point to you and say, well, you have done something wrong. It's not like you slam the door in their face. We have some people who they go through life and they're not bad people, they're not selfish people, but they have trouble seeing beyond their own wants and desires. They heard too many times from too many teachers and people on TV that everyone acts out of self-interest. And so I call these people, they're the people that let the door slam on the person behind them. They didn't intend to let that door slam on the person behind them. They just never even noticed the other person was there. Well, are they guilty of wrongdoing? Well, they didn't notice the other person was there. They're just not in the habit of looking around for other people. Do you have a duty to look around for other people? No. But if you do, and you help other people out, that's a good thing. That's virtuous. But if you didn't know the person was there because you cruised through life, not trying to hurt anybody, but just not paying any attention to anybody else, you're going to let doors slam on other people's face and then be amazed when you look around and you see that they're laying on the ground, all their purchases all over the place. So there's a difference between things you're obligated to do, do no harm, as the foundation of medical ethics goes, do no harm. The doctor doesn't have to come in and see you on Christmas time and bring you a special present too, because you're still in the hospital. If he were to do that, that'd be a humdinger of a doctor, and he's very compassionate and considerate and all of that. But he's under no duty to do that.
Thank you for clearing that definition. Moving along, is there any necessary relationship between morality and religion, just in general terms?
No, there is no necessary relationship between morality and religion. Bertrand Russell was an atheist. Richard Dawkins is an atheist. Richard Dawkins is alive today. Daniel Dennett is an atheist. All of these people still have to figure out, how ought I to treat you? And how ought you to treat me? And the three people I just mentioned happen to be very smart, happen to be people who have spent a fair amount of time every now and then to try to figure out an aspect of morality and write about it and share it with the world. So morality matters to them, yet they're atheists. The atheist too has to figure out, how ought I to treat others and how ought others to treat me? Now, does that mean religion is wholly irrelevant to what goes on in the moral world? Well, one would like to think that it's not wholly irrelevant. One would like to think that people who are religious, regardless of their religion, that people who are religious have additional psychological urges to act kindly and beneficently toward others. Now, the person who is religious also has to figure out, because he's not going to goose step his way through his own religion, or else he'd be in Jonestown. Jonestown, where Jones had all those people drink cyanide in their Kool-Aid. They'd just be blindly walking through the directives of another human being. I don't think any religion is that. That's when you walk away from religion and move into a cult. But in religions, there are leaders, and leaders do give advice, but the followers too have to think about the reasonableness of following the advice, and how does the advice help me understand how I ought to treat another or how others ought to treat me. So the religious person and the atheist are both in the same boat when it comes to trying to figure out how ought I to treat others. The religious person, have they got something in addition to that need to figure things out? Well, they might, if they have that psychological and extra psychological boost to want to do it right because their God or gods wish them to do that sort of thing. So that would be the connection, but that means it's not a necessary connection. The psychiatrist Robert Coles had interviewed kids all over the world between 4 and 8 years old, and turned out kids, no matter where they were raised, up to that 4 to 8 years old thing, had roughly 3 questions that they all wanted to know about. But one of the questions was, how am I supposed to treat others? Now, he interviewed people in communist China, which stands against the church, whatever the church might be. And everyone knows about the mistreatment of the Muslim community in Southwest China. So the Chinese aren't very supportive of religious positions. And officially, it's an atheist state. But even so, kids raised in northern China still asked Coles, I wonder about how I'm supposed to treat other people. I wonder how they're supposed to treat me. We're a herd animal. We're naturally, instinctually inclined to be cooperative. And because unlike other herd animals, we have this richly textured language, we're like those kids because we're more likely then to not just be inclined to be cooperative, but we want to figure out how to be cooperative. And so we use our language, our richly textured language, to say, how can I best be a companion with others, and how should they be treating me?
So, Dr. Wagner, in your new book about math, could tie this to mathematics.
All right.
We make assumptions in math before thinking about mathematical matters. I think you have it in your book saying these assumptions are called axioms in mathematics.
Right.
Euclidean geometry, for example, begins assuming the truth of standard logic and 5 geometrical axioms. But the non-Euclidean geometry has only 4.
In non-Euclidean geometry, there's only 4 axioms, right?
Can you talk a little about that, and then about Kurt Gödel?
All right. First of all, with any kind of mathematics, actually with life in general, if we're going to think, let's talk about thinking first. Thinking is a verb. And so it's an action word. What's the action? It's moving chunks of thought about. Computers think, we think. Chunks of thought are moved about in computer minds and in our minds. Now, in each case, no thinking could take place if there was no thoughts to begin with. There's nothing to move around. And so without going into this kind of depth, the ancient Greeks had already recognized that we were going to have good justifications for our geometric claims, but we wanted to be rigorous. We need to define what we're starting with. And so Euclid famously came up with his 5 axioms and with his commitment to logic. And then he was able to construct all sorts of resilient claims about the geometric world that exists on a plane. Okay. And we call it plane geometry in today's world. Okay. And Euclid's geometry holds up well in today's world. Beginning in the 19th and 20th century, you had people like Karl Gauss and Lobachevsky and others recognizing that if we took the fifth axiom of Euclid and treated it as a theorem, we got a different sort of geometry, a geometry that Albert Einstein and his most important assistant ever, Emmy Noether, recognized as key to understanding the universe. He had two big ideas, Brownian motion, which we can talk about some other time, but the other one was space being curved. So Euclid's plane geometry wasn't going to explain to us what we needed to explain to understand that the world of curved space is very different. I'm going to say a couple of words about the world of curved space just as an elaboration before continuing with where Gödel comes in. In plane geometry, like we've all had back in high school, we know that every triangle has 180 degrees in it. It has three angles. Imagine taking a basketball and cutting it in half. Now you take your straight edge and you draw a triangle. Now look at that triangle. The three sides are going to be convex. They're going to bend inward. If you then measure the angles, one of the things you're going to find is that all triangles in convex space have less than 180 degrees. Now let's take that basketball and turn it upside down. So now we're going to take our straight edge and we're going to make a triangle on top of the basketball. Well, now we're going to say each side is bulging, right? And then if you measure the angles of that triangle on the outside of the basketball, all triangles and, oh, it's concave space on the inside, convex space on the outside, that your triangles will all have greater than 180 degrees. And then, of course, when you have the space that Einstein and Noether imagined being our real space, you have concave and convex spaces intermingled throughout the real universe. And so now, instead of talking about straight lines, we started talking about geodesics and so on. You know, it seemed that with math, you put enough effort into any kind of mathematical reflection, sooner or later you have a power that no other discipline can deliver. You've started with some humble assumptions that presumably everybody can agree to. They're simple. And with these chunks of thought and using the laws of logic, you can deduce a truth about the world of mathematics. Now, part of the reason for that is mathematics isn't about the world. It's about, you know, some kind of world of abstraction. And we get to use mathematics to organize our thinking about the world we live in. But pure math isn't about the world we live in. It's about this world of abstraction. Okay, now, Kurt Gödel, one of the two great logicians of the 20th century, he was bothered by the effort of mathematicians to want to prove everything, to prove it, even in the abstract world of mathematics. And so one of the things he did, he developed what's called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. He proved that in arithmetic, for example, you can't prove any of the conclusions in arithmetic without going to assumptions that are meta-arithmetical. That is, they stand outside the language of arithmetic itself. And this problem of always having to go to a meta language if you're going to talk about and construct proof within a language. It's true about when we do our computer programming and so on and so forth. There's always this, we've got to step outside the language of the mathematics that we're concerned with, or the algorithm procedures that we're concerned with, to justify how they are to be manipulated later on. This incompleteness theorem led Gödel thinking that, well, there are some things that clearly seem to be true, and yet we can't demonstrate that they're true. And so one thing that he came up with was, and for even is one of the things he's telling us is that even in math, we can't prove everything absolutely. All of the sciences employ math to justify their conclusions. So if you can't prove absolutely the claims of mathematics, then that uncertainty also underlies each and every science that uses mathematics. And we do good work with our sciences. And mathematics is probably the most splendid creation of the human intellect. It gives us a certainty no other animal can even imagine. It's wonderful stuff, but it can't guarantee absolute truth. Now, you accept that. Why would you challenge conclusions derived from moral thinking? Because, well, they begin with assumptions, and you can't guarantee the truth of some moral argument. I mean, the assumptions had to start from somewhere. Well, yes, that's all true. But as Gödel showed us about mathematics, it's true of math. And it's true of all the sciences. But we don't throw math and all the sciences out. We don't sweep them off the desk saying they're all just a matter of opinion, or everybody has their own truth. We tell scientists you got it wrong when some of their inferences don't seem to hold up well, or the collection of data didn't hold up well to begin with. We do the same thing in math. Well, why shouldn't we treat our moral reflections in the same way? You start with the simplest assumptions you can. And from those assumptions, using logic, you construct an inferential chain leading to some guidelines, moral rules. And it's a good idea to live by those until someone can show that there's some kind of ambiguity or something in that chain of reasoning. And so we need to patch it up a bit more so we can get a better outcome from our work, just like we do in sciences. And we don't discredit the sciences because we have to do that with the sciences. Why would we discredit moral thinking? Because we have to do that with moral thinking, whether it's creating our own guidelines for how we should live our lives, or looking to the laws that should govern how we live our lives. Presumably, when we look at tax law, which is a law of promising, we're going to redistribute wealth, and we're doing it because we think it's the fairest thing that we can achieve, and implicit in all that is that we promise to abide by these networks of guidelines that we put together as a community. And that promise, by the way, is, again, just a moral vehicle itself. It's all a moral apparatus, but it's incredibly potent for helping us live life together. In physics right now, you have a lot of physicists trying to develop something called string theory as a way of making sense of the quantum world that they've never been able to make quite so much sense of before. Now, the math looks real good, but so far we have no experimental data to confirm, even loosely, our work in string theory. But we keep working on it because it looks so promising. We keep working on our tax laws because we want to improve them. And the grounding is all going to be a moral grounding ultimately, but that doesn't discredit it. If somehow we can create what looks, given our definitions and how we've used logic, a more fair distribution of resources for the community we share, seems like a good idea. Just like it seems like a good idea to pursue string theory for the time being in physics. So Gödel's construction of an incompleteness proof showed us that moral reflection, there's no reason to discredit moral reflection because it relies on assumptions to begin with. Because that's true of every science and math itself. And none of those are discredited because of that.
That's profound. What you just said, like every science begins with assumptions. That no one can say that no one ever thought about anything without first making some kind of assumption.
Right.
So with that, is there any good reason to think that moral thinking is necessarily more subjective than thinking in the sciences or thinking more generally?
There is no necessary reason for thinking that our reflection and morality must be less reliable than thinking in the sciences. Someone might say, well, when we come up with conclusions in the sciences, we can always turn to nature and see if she's well behaved given our construction here. Now, the same can be said about our moral rules. We think we've worked out a certain set of laws or a certain set of moral conventions that we intend to help order our lives together. And then we discover, oh goodness, if we continue to live according to these guidelines, look at some of the things that are happening to some people that we don't think should happen. So there's no necessary reason for saying that the one must be looser than the other. It may happen to be that, moral thinking has a little bit more flexibility in it or latitude in it than, say, physics at the moment. Perhaps that'll always be the case, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the case.
Thank you. So, which is more important, to respect a person or respect the culture, or respect a culture?
Do cultures matter at all if there's no persons in them? Cultures disappear if persons disappear. So just as a matter of logical priority, it would seem that you start with a fundamental building block, and that's persons. And the function of a culture is to serve the personhood of those in the culture. When people say things like, well, some people are just a product of their culture. Well, that's kind of offensive, because essentially you're saying to that person, you've been captured. You don't have any autonomy to exercise. You're incapacitated when it comes to overriding an inclination you have. You have just picked up these inclinations, either genetically or culturally, and you're captured. What a way to degrade one another, as saying we're nothing more than these pawns. We try to improve cultures at times, don't we? We try to improve our own culture. We say, I think we can make this better. Well, as soon as we say, I think we can make this better, what you're doing is you're turning to morality with the idea of treating persons in that culture better. And so morality becomes from time to time a driver of cultural improvement, or at least change, rather than culture being the driver of morality. No one ever says, let's look at culture and make sure that morality matches up with our culture. Yeah, we do it the other way around. We find ourselves in a culture, but then if we want it to improve, we look for how we might improve our culture. And that means we're asking questions about morality. Yeah, slavery. Slavery was once ubiquitous. Everybody either enslaved somebody else or were enslaved by somebody else. It took us a long time to get away from that. But we did get away from that. If you let the cultural ideologue claim that everything is just a product of your culture, then slavery would be as ubiquitous today as it ever was. But one of the things we know is that while slavery was once everywhere, by the year of 1981, the last nation on the face of the earth had formally outlawed it. What does that mean? Well, it means something like this must have happened. You know the story of Adam and Eve and all that, right? So let's imagine there had to have been a moral Adam somewhere in the mix of all the people. I mean, there's people everywhere, but one of those people was kind of like a moral Adam. And unlike all the other people in the culture, moral Adam goes, you know what? I don't think this slavery stuff is right. Oh, that's crazy talk, man. Everybody knows slavery is just fine. That's the way the world is. And moral Adam goes, no, I don't think so. I think there's something wrong with it. And then here's the next thing that happens. It had to have happened. There had to have been a moral Eve, if you will. And what do I mean by a moral Eve? Another person who heard Adam say this crazy talk that is so countercultural. She believes him. So she hears the strange talk that's countercultural. She goes, I think you're right. I think our culture got it wrong. I think we've stumbled upon something that is right-minded, and the whole culture that we're surrounded by is wrong-minded on this issue. Something like that had to have happened and grown. And we can watch around the world. It took us thousands of years, but we can watch around the world slowly, the dominoes tipping over, where the cultures collapsed with regards to the idea of slavery. Yeah, we see what that culture has done over there, eliminating slavery. They probably did the right thing. And now we eliminate slavery. And now they eliminate slavery. Where once it was ubiquitous, the dominoes started tipping over until the last nation on the face of the earth outlawed it. If culture determined everything, that couldn't have happened. But if culture is driven at times by moral adventurers, people of deep sympathetic insight, that's how you achieve cultural improvement. Mother Teresa goes to Calcutta. There were people dying in the streets all the time. Nobody did anything about it. But she did. And other women joined her. And people from around the world started sending money to her to build her hospice. Well, in that culture, there was no source of support for that. But she came in and changed that by her example and the others that joined her. There is a better way for our culture to be. It's a morally better way. Oh my gosh. One of the best things that schools do, and as long as they don't trivialize it, but I like going into schools on a visit every now and then and see that they've got blackboards and displays in the hallway or whatever to talk about things like respect, talk about things like integrity. And so those little moral signposts, without having a lot of rules right below them, but having the concepts being impressed upon the minds of the kids as they walk through the hallways. And maybe the teachers during an appropriate class or whatever mention about the heroism of some person being evident hand in hand with their commitment to, say, integrity, or their commitment to the well-being of others, or their commitment to respect, or their commitment to loyalty, and so on and so forth.
I remember those posters in middle school and high school: teamwork, collaboration, respect, kindness. Dr. Wagner, for the last um, question for the day, for this session, it's not really a question, but when you talk about currency, right, like the dollars and yanks and francs or pesos, whatever the monetary currency, um, they do not, they're not the same, obviously, as the rock, water, and the wind. They don't exist in the world the way the rocks and the water and the wind exist. But the dollar has more power, right? The dollar can be the proximate cause of a dam or its demolition. So the idea of currency is an innovation of humans, um, and now function of approximately causation way in the world. Um, I know that you have mentioned in many of your lectures about money or currency being seen as a promise, right? So you have mentioned that promises make marriage, banking, business, and all sorts of relationships and activities possible in our world. Promising is a matter of placing a person under obligation to another. Mm-hmm. And you have also said that promising, whatever else it might be, or however it might be enforced in certain circumstances, it's most fundamental. It's at its most fundamental level. It's a moral innovation. You mentioned that in many of the lectures when we were taking your ethics class. What does the practice of promising tell us about moral nature of human experience?
Promising is a moral innovation, and it may be the most foundational of all the moral innovations we arrived at once we had our richly textured language to move us forward beyond mere cooperation and mere morality, which is sensitivity to the importance of cooperating. When with our richly textured language, we started looking for guidelines and how we might live better. The fundamental moral innovation of all was the promise. I thee wed made possible the institution of marriage. I will gladly pay you on Tuesday for a hamburger today, made possible the exchange of credit and the institution of banking. I will give you a bunch of crumply up paper and you will give me a nice couch for my house. I am very wealthy and I get a few computer keys and I send $1 million over to my private account in Switzerland. What went over there? There were no crumply green things that went over there. In fact, nothing went over there except for some electrical exchanges that went through the air. And now you say I've got $1 million over there. And I can take from that $1 million and buy myself a fancy Bentley or a Rolls Royce just by going to my computer and having some of that sent back and transferred to the car dealership. All of that survives only because of the moral foundation of promising. If people stopped promising, before you know it, cooperation would disappear and we would all become a wolf pack without any unity. We would each be a wolf tearing at the flesh of each other just for the purposes of survival. When Adam Smith, often called the father of capitalism, when Adam Smith first talked about, and he gets all his credit for Wealth of Nations, that was a good book and all that. foundation of capitalism. But his magisterial book was a book called A Theory of Moral Sentiments. And Adam Smith said that economics is the moral science. And what he meant by that was he was going right to the heart of the idea of promising. I will gladly pay you on Tuesday for a hamburger today. I can make pins, but I don't have a farm. If I make enough pins for the sewing that your wife does, could you give me a couple of baskets of organic produce? So we do some bartering. That bartering is exchanging promises, right? I will do this for you if you will do this for me. Well, I did this for you and you didn't give me that produce. You owe me. You're obligated to follow through on what? On your promise. Well, and if you don't follow through, then what? Well, then you're a dirty dog. And in our communities, because we want to protect the practice of promising, we'll try to punish you for reneging on your promises. Now, some people might say, well, yeah, see, it's all about law. No, it's not law. It's all about morality. If it hadn't been the morality of promising, there would have been no concern about punishing those who defect from the promises they make. Any law student knows within the first, you take contract law your first year of law school. Every law student knows within a couple of weeks of sitting in those classes on contracts that he's studying the law of promising. He learns that not all contracts have to be written to be legally binding promises. Written contracts only provide more evidence of what promises are said to exist, but the law is there to uphold the practice of promising. We can make verbal promises. They're more difficult to enforce because it's more difficult to bring the evidence in that Smith said to Jones and Jones said to Smith, I would gladly pay in Tuesday for a hamburger today. So it's an evidentiary problem, but the promise is what the contract is all about. Hey, if we have evidence that you said that you'd pay him on Tuesday for a hamburger today and it's Tuesday and you're not offering up your payment, then there's going to be some lawful action to support promising in our community.
Wow, thank
Right.
you so much.
Right now with the Ukraine war, one of the Ukraine war, and I go to a simple thing. Ukraine war, I mean, you got Russia that's all upset because the ruble isn't being accepted for all sorts of goods that the Russians would like to buy. So essentially we've said, we're breaking the promise off on that one. Your ruble will not be accepted in exchange for a yacht or whatever it might be. And so then the Russians are saying, well, then you're breaking your promise to us. You can add all the highfalutin talk you want, but that's really what's going on. Hey, if you won't honor our ruble, then you're breaking the promise, and now we can't buy a yacht, or we can't buy, foodstuffs or whatever else. Little kids are challenged early on to learn and understand promising. Well, Dad, you promised that we would go to the carnival today. I know, son, and I did promise, but I didn't know it was going to rain. Well, it's not going to rain a lot, and we can bring an umbrella. Son, it just wouldn't. Dad, you're breaking your promise. And breaking a promise is serious, even if it's a kid talking to a dad. So the kid knows he's got him on something. You don't break promises. And so the dad is trying to explain what mitigating circumstances might make it necessary for this promise to be broken or perhaps modified so that the actual day of visiting the carnival will be changed, but the visit to the carnival still stands as part of the promise that will sustain. Kids are very sensitive from early ages on about the potency of promising. They get mad at one another if somebody makes a promise and doesn't keep up with it, as they should. It's important that they learn about promising from the earliest days of their acquisition of speech habits onward.
Thank you for that explanation of promise. I mean, that if you think about it, it can apply everywhere.
Well, absolutely.
Like, you know, a promise between the student and the educator in the classroom. I'm willing to learn if you're willing to teach, or the other way around. I'm willing to teach if you're willing to learn. I mean, that exchange is applicable to almost everything.
Yeah, I promise to get your papers graded and back to you by next Tuesday.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Tuesday. You said you'd have the papers graded. Well, yeah, but this came up. Well, we hear your excuses, but you promised. And so those excuses we may not find sufficient as mitigating circumstances for why you don't have those papers for us. Yeah, promising, it's everywhere. Some promises that we make, we ought not to make. For example, something I've said before in one of our talks is that what you treat as rewarding is what your students or your children will find as rewarding. And so if you treat pizzas and donuts and DVDs as rewarding, so that if you behave the way I want you to behave on Friday, we're going to eat pizza, donuts, and watch a DVD. You're sending a message that it's not learning that's important, but it's donuts, pizza, and DVD that's really important. Now, in saying that to the kids, not only are you teaching them that the wrong things are rewarding, but you're also making a promise, right? You guys behave, then we can do this non-educational stuff. If you keep up your end of the promise, then I'll keep up my end of the promise, and we won't do any educational stuff on Friday. So some promises ought not to be made. Guy says, I'll pay you $10,000 to kill my wife. Okay, you got a deal. You shouldn't make promises like that, you know? So promising is, you know, this foundational moral innovation, but it can also be misused as well as used well.
Well, with that, Dr. Wagner, we'll conclude this session. Thank you so much for discussing this topic of thinking about morality. I hope to see you again with another topic. And as always, thank you for the time and allowing us, your students, to dig deeper in the ocean that you possess, the wealth of knowledge you have. Thank you for sharing that with us.
I'm looking forward to doing so, and I promise.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.